So hello and welcome everyone to our webinar, Where's the Dirt? Getting to the Root of Soil Erosion. This webinar is brought to you today by a grant on the protection of cropping watershed systems and climate change awareness in Lamont County. It was funded by the Canadian Agricultural Partnership, which is brought to you by the Government of Alberta and the Government of Canada. And the project partners on this grant are Lamont County, Cows and Fish, the North Saskatchewan Watershed Alliance, and the Vermilion River Watershed Alliance. So my name is Michelle Gordy, and I will be your host today. I am a watershed planning coordinator with the North Saskatchewan Watershed Alliance, and I also help facilitate the Vermilion River Watershed Alliance. I would first like to acknowledge that Lamont County rests on Treaty 6 territory and that we are all treaty people. We acknowledge and respect the histories, languages, and cultures of First Nations, Métis, Inuit, and all First Peoples of Canada, whose footsteps have marked these lands for centuries and whose presence continues to enrich our vibrant communities. So this webinar is all about the issue of soil erosion, and we have three lovely speakers today. So we will be beginning this session talking about what soil erosion is, then talk about soil erosion in the context of Lamont County, and then we'll wrap up the session providing you with some techniques to control soil erosion. But before we get started, let's go through some quick housekeeping for the session. So if you could please mute your microphone and turn off your video. If you have a question, please type it in the Q&A box. This is where questions go, but if you have general comments, you can put those in the chat box. We'll have time for questions at the end of each presentation. And at the end of the webinar today, we'll stay on for another 5 minutes just for general discussion and questions, and you'll be able to use your microphone then. And also just to note, this webinar is being recorded and it will be available to watch soon on YouTube, so keep your eye out for that. So before I introduce our first speaker, we have a quick poll question for you. So let me just launch that real quick. So the question is, which best describes you and the hat you're wearing today? And oh, there's actually 3 questions here. So there's also, where are you signing in from today? And rate your understanding of soil and water interactions, impacts of erosion, and techniques to minimize erosion on the landscape. So we'll give you some time to answer all 3 of those questions for us. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and close the poll and let's look at the results. So it looks like we have a lot of people from nonprofit or non-government organizations. We've got quite a few agricultural producers and acreage owners and several from government. So that's awesome. Even some students. We've got a lot of people who are elsewhere in Alberta or outside of Alberta. Welcome. And then looking at your understanding of soil erosion. So it looks like most of you know a little bit. So I think this is going to be a great webinar for you today. So our first speaker today is Tanya Lewiski. She is a riparian specialist with Cows and Fish, otherwise known as Alberta Riparian Habitat Management Society. And she'll be giving us an introduction to soil erosion. So take it away, Tanya.
Wonderful, thanks, Michelle. Let's see. That's going to work smoothly for me today. Can you see that all right?
Looks great.
Excellent. All right. So thanks for joining us today, everybody. So as Michelle has said, my name is Tanya Lewiski, and I'm a riparian specialist with Cows and Fish. So I'm going to start off today with introducing Cows and Fish, who we are, and then get a little bit more into the discussion on erosion. So Cows and Fish is a provincial nonprofit society that has been working in partnership with landowners, communities, agencies, and organizations, delivering riparian awareness and management since 1992. So this year is actually our 30-year anniversary, which is very exciting. So if you are interested, keep your eyes and ears open. There's going to be a few events over the course of the coming year. And as Michelle said, our full name is the Alberta Riparian Habitat Management Society. But that's a bit of a mouthful, so you'll understand why we're mostly known as Cows and Fish. So this is our vision and our mission, and we achieve these through empowering people who live, work, and play in Alberta's riparian areas. So Cows and Fish has its roots in agriculture. 30 years ago, a walk with our founder, Lauren Fitch, and a landowner inspired the creation of Cows and Fish. Specifically, it inspired what we call a thinking pathway, which became and still is the Cows and Fish process. So as an organization, we only go where we're invited. Whether it's a producer, a stewardship group, or municipality, we don't cold call anyone or point fingers and say, hey, this riparian area needs some work. But we work with individuals and groups who identify that they have a need. And so we do our work as part of this thinking pathway. And it usually starts with building awareness. What are riparian areas and why are they important? And from there, it often continues into team building, tool building, community-based action, and most importantly, monitoring. Have we achieved what we set out to achieve and did it work? And of course, through that monitoring comes more learning and awareness. So this is an ongoing process, hence the nice big circle. So I've been talking about this word riparian a lot. And what does that mean? So in short, it's where land connects with water. The riparian areas are those green zones around rivers and streams, lakes and wetlands. You may have heard it called a floodplain, shoreline, stream banks, bottomlands. So riparian areas occupy about 2 to 5% of the settled portion of Alberta, which isn't a lot, but they tend to be some of the more productive areas on our landscape. So whether it's groundwater or surface water influenced, these areas tend to be more green, more lush, more productive than the adjacent uplands. You'll often notice that riparian areas tend to green up earlier and stay green a little bit longer than their uplands due to this influence of water. So how do we know where the riparian area stops and the upland begins? So we use 3 different clues to help us define the riparian area. The first of which is water. It can be present seasonally, or it can be present all year long, and it can be at the surface, or it can be kind of close to the surface. And this presence of water will affect the types of soils that are in the area. And in turn, the soils affect the types of vegetation that grow. And because we can see the vegetation without having to dig down into the ground like we would to look at the soils, we usually use the changes in plant communities to help us determine that riparian boundary. And it's this interaction between water, soils, and vegetation that make riparian areas unique and sensitive. And they're very important in terms of the role that they play in our landscape. So the functions that happen in riparian areas are related to water quality, water quantity, water supply, primary productivity, biodiversity. And these riparian functions also tend to provide humans with what we call ecosystem services. And these ecosystem services provided by riparian areas include filtering and buffering water, which means cleaner water for us, infiltrating and storing water. So this increases groundwater stores and refills aquifers that we use for our drinking water or well water. And it also provides homes for fish and wildlife that we value. And these are all things that the environment can do for us free of charge when the landscape is in good condition. So whether it's a flowing system like a creek or a non-flowing system like a wetland or a slough, all riparian areas involve one important thing, and that is water and wet land. And we know that this wetness can sometimes be a problem. In agricultural settings, it's perhaps easier to see the downside of riparian areas and their water sources. And we often hear reasons that producers, maybe they don't like riparian areas for a variety of reasons. So getting stuck either with your boots or with a truck or with a combine, it's never a good time. There can be animal illness or loss if they get stuck in the mud or if they get washed downstream. And they can definitely be inconvenient to work around, especially if you've got large machinery and you've got a bunch of small wetlands or a small creek that's kind of meandering through your property. And the benefits of retaining these riparian areas aren't always apparent. And sometimes these benefits don't even benefit the producer. They benefit people that are further downstream or just that they don't even know that live in cities. And so it leads us to a question that we sometimes hear. Are dry riparian areas still important? Do they still provide any value, ecological or otherwise? And why should we keep them? This is an especially good question in drier years, when that wetland or creek fringe that was just a puddle last year is as dry as a bone this year. If those riparian areas are a nuisance and they're only wet part of the time anyway, what's the harm in turning that into a crop or a pasture or a trail? Well, the answer to that is we can sometimes have unintended consequences. So looking at these photos that we're looking at right here, this used to be a canola field. This is not an old channel. This used to be canola field. And this is definitely an extreme situation of accelerated erosion. It doesn't happen overnight, and it doesn't usually start this big. This has been many, many years and a few generations in the making. But this is something that can happen if we are not taking good care of our riparian areas. So now we're getting into the nitty-gritty of erosion. So this is a general overview of erosion and the types of erosion that we experience in Alberta, particularly in agricultural landscapes. And we're certainly not experts in all things erosion. I'm a riparian specialist, not an erosion specialist. So just keep that in mind as we go through the rest of this presentation. So what is erosion? It's the loss of soil by wind and water and ice. Of course, erosion is not unique to riparian areas, but being in close proximity to water means that if not properly managed, these areas can become more susceptible to water erosion. And throughout this presentation, when referring to erosion, I'm going to be focusing on water erosion. So whether it's that water is from rainfall or snowmelt or stream flow from a water body. So it's important to remember that erosion is a natural process. Rivers, streams, creeks, they are all naturally eroding and depositing more or less in equilibrium. So as the water comes around the bend, it is carving out, eroding one side of the creek bend, and then depositing that sediment on the other side, kind of on these inside bends. So you can see over here that there's a bit of some deposit that's happening here. And rivers naturally move over time, and we can see evidence of this in old channel bends all across the landscape. But we know that humans and our actions can upset this equilibrium and accelerate erosion on the landscape. So here, I'm going to introduce to you a couple of terms that we use when talking about erosion. So runoff, or overland flow, is a term that you've likely heard. And this is what water is before it gets to a channel or a basin. So it can be from a heavy rainfall or a quick spring melt. And all of that water is just trying to find a place. And as water moves, it will pick up sediments, and this is where the erosion is happening. And so it starts off as, or it can start off as sheet erosion. So this is water moving overland. So there's no channel associated with it. And most of it is moving in a similar thickness and a similar speed. And as it's moving along, trying to find its way to the closest water body, it's picking up soil particles as it moves. So it's like losing some topsoil off of a field during a moderate rain event. And that can progress to real erosion. So this is where water starts to move through small channels or starting to carve out small channels, as you can see in this photo here. These are starting to become rills. And when these channels become larger, it becomes gully erosion. And so that's, the most severe of the types of erosion. And this one is obviously quite a severe example as well. And it just takes enough of a disturbance, whether it's a cattle trail, truck trail, ruts, anything that water can get into and start stealing soil particles as it's flowing by. This can lead to this cascade of erosion events. So we also have in-channel erosion. And these, as I was saying earlier, are natural processes that usually happen gradually over time. Sometimes with large events that can cause a rapid shift in conditions, like very large flooding events. But our actions can definitely accelerate these processes. And so here's an example of slumping. And so slumping is when erosion is occurring along or under the banks, and it causes the banks to fall into the channel. So you can see here that these banks have just, there's nothing holding it in place anymore, and they've fallen into the channel. And there's also down cutting. So this usually happens when a flowing system can no longer reach its floodplain. So during flooding events, water is traveling very fast. It has lots and lots of energy and lots of speed. And often when it's allowed to flood over its banks, that dissipates some of that energy, and then that will reduce some of its erosion potential. But when it's stuck in its banks, all of that energy has nowhere to go other than to carve away at the banks and carve downwards. And so that's what we call down cutting. And there's nowhere else for that energy to dissipate. And so it's just moving downwards and eroding downwards. So factors that can contribute to erosion include the type of soil. So there are some soils that are more erodible than others, as well as topography. So water moves down a hill or steep bank a lot quicker than it moves over flat land. As well as ground cover. So whether the ground is vegetated and what type of vegetation that's growing there will also affect how much erosion you're going to see. So unprotected soils give up more sediment than protected soils. And while there's not much that can really be done about the type of soil that you have in an area, or even the natural topography, short of heavy construction, which may or may not actually have the intended effect if you actually have erosion issues already. Generally, we can control or at least have an influence on what type of ground cover there is. So this is what I'm going to be focusing on for the rest of for the next bit of this presentation. So by looking at these three pictures, which one do you think has the most potential for erosion? Is it the one on the left, the one in the middle, or the one on the right? And if you answered the one on the right, then you're correct. So as vegetation cover diminishes, runoff increases, which in turn increases the amount of erosion, and then also the amount of sediment that's in the water. So an area that has lots and lots of vegetation, the water can be slowed down, and there's less bare soil for that water to pick up soil particles as it's moving through. In this middle photograph, we've got some vegetation, but we also see that there's some bare ground bits here. And so while the vegetation will protect some of this soil, this bare soil bits are definitely going to give up some of its particles as the water is moving through. And then looking at this photo on the right, where it's mostly bare gravel and rocks, that when water is flowing off of this area, there's going to be lots and lots of sediment that comes with it. And so it's bad for water quality looking at this, but it also means that you're losing soil and lots of erosion is happening. So how does vegetation help protect against erosion? So it actually works in two different ways. It works above ground as well as below ground. So above ground, vegetation acts like an umbrella. So it slows down or catches rainwater as it falls, and that dissipates that energy so that by the time that raindrop hits the ground, it no longer has the energy to move soil particles. As well, below ground, the roots of the plant help bind the soil and keep it in place. So by looking over here, we can see that these roots are getting really nice down and deep and kind of creating a net that is holding the soil particles together. However, not all plant roots are created equal. So native plants like trees and willows and sedges all have excellent, what we call deep binding roots that helps protect against erosion. So again, you can see over here that there's lots of that nettedness, and it's kind of fingers that are going down to the soil and holding it together. And that will help protect against erosion. So whether it's runoff in the upland or if it's in-channel erosion that's happening in a creek. Non-native species like Kentucky bluegrass or smooth brome or quackgrass, and even noxious invasive species like Canada thistle and perennial sow thistle, they have roots, but they don't have really good binding roots. So they're either really short, and so they don't get deep down, or they have really deep roots, but very tap root-like, so they don't have any of those the netting that will help hold that soil together. So these species generally are not as good at preventing erosion, particularly with their roots. So these are just a couple of examples of some stream banks that are dominated by non-native grasses here. And particularly over in this one here, you can see quite easily that some of this, the bank is starting to drop into the channel because it does not have sufficient roots to hold it in place. So another important thing to consider about erosion is the speed at which water is moving. So natural flowing systems have meanders or bends that help dissipate some of the energy. So as water is moving through a nice meandering creek, it's kind of bumping up against these outer bends, and that helps dissipate some of that energy further downstream. And so it reduces the erosion potential of these creeks and streams. So having ample vegetation also helps in slowing down the water, particularly when talking about overland flow. In contrast, by removing these meanders in natural systems, or by creating drainage channels or drainage ditches to move unwanted water off the land faster, this has a compounding negative erosive impact. So when you increase water velocity by 2 times, it increases the ability of that stream to erode by 4 times. And again, if you double the velocity, it gives 64 times the ability to transport sediment. So that's massively increasing the erosive power of water when we straighten these meanders. So this slow water means less erosion concept can also be applied at the landscape scale. So wetlands and well-vegetated areas can help slow water after large flooding events. We can't stop floods or erosion from happening altogether, but as water runs off in large quantities, either from a fast snow melt or large storm events, water will pool in areas that are available, such as wetland basins or beaver dams. And if there are small localized basins to trap and store this water won't immediately enter into the large flowing system. And that will reduce the peak of the flood and reduces the erosion potential. So if there are no wetlands or vegetated riparian or other natural areas, all the water flows directly into the flowing system, which will overwhelm its banks and causes flooding further downstream and causes more erosion as the water is moving quicker, getting to that system, as well as once it gets into that system, the erosive force of that flooded system is going to be huge. Where does all that sediment go? When it's lost from the landscape, when it's being carved out of these areas, what happens to it? Where does it go? Well, it depends on the system. So it may just end up a little ways down the way. So over here, you can kind of see there's a bit of a puddle, and that's where all the sediment is kind of hanging out. So it could be on the same property, or in some instances, it could be washed all the way down to the next flowing water body, or to your neighbor's property, or to that next bridge. You don't really know, it depends on the system. And once it's gone, it will never come back, at least not naturally, unless your neighbor upstream is also having erosion issues. But so it's best to try and keep it in place. And so what can we do to prevent this erosion from happening? Well, we can't prevent it because it is that natural process. And our actions and management can exacerbate things, but we can also help to mitigate it. So Brett and Carrie on the next couple of presentations are going to give some management tools that can help lessen erosion and its impacts, and talk about things like vegetation buffers, bioengineering and willow staking, as well as regenerative design principles. So I'm looking forward to those next couple of presentations. And on that note, that's it for me. So as a nonprofit, these are our members. And on that note, I am happy to take any questions right now, or if you have any more specific questions you would like to ask, feel free to call or email me. And yes, thank you so much for the opportunity and for being here.
That was a wonderful presentation, Tanya. Thank you. So if anyone has any questions, please pop those into the Q&A box and we will answer them. I'm not seeing any yet.
Okay, I mean, either that means I did a really great job or a really terrible job.
You did a really great job. I know I learned a lot. Okay, well, since we're not getting any questions in yet, we'll go ahead and move on to our next speaker. And then if someone has a question about this, then we can answer it at the end. So
perfect, sounds great.
All right, so let me just share my screen again. Okay. So our next speaker today is Brett Weeks, and he will be talking to us about soil erosion in the context of Lamont County. He is an agricultural and environmental coordinator with the county. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to you, Brett.
Perfect. Thank you, Michelle. So to continue on from the presentation from Tanya here, we'll go into mine, which is good background information. So we'll go into some soil erosion. We're going to focus mainly on fluvial erosion. I don't have really anything on wind erosion, as it's not really our major problem here. It's mainly soil erosion we deal with from water. So first, I just want to take a note on Alberta sediments, right? So Alberta, especially in the Lamont County region, we're dealing with some brown chernozemic soil types, right? We have a little bit of clay, a little bit of silt, and some sand. So we get a fairly decent loam going on there. So we're definitely susceptible to some erosion from that. It's not like we just have a tight packed clay or something like that. We do tend to have a pretty fluffy, organic rich A horizon in our soil type. Also to note here, in this picture, you can kind of see in the middle here, right? Alberta bedrock isn't really a rock. It's still can erode, right? It's still quite loose, kind of clay pack sediment, right? So you can still see some pretty drastic erosion, even though you're breaking through down into your bedrock horizons or your sea horizons in your soil. So I was doing a little bit of research for this presentation here, and so I came across a study here done in 1985 with the Canadian government, and so they did a really good job on summarizing some of the points for Alberta soil erosion here. So they said the first step for soil erosion is detachment of small soil particles or aggregates that break away from the soil surface, either by the impact of raindrops or the sheer force of running water. With infield observations of the practices across Lamont County, as well as other municipalities in Alberta, it's definitely noticeable that tillage can be observed closer and closer to riparian areas and systems, drastically escalating that detachment. So we're seeing farmers encroaching into stream right-of-ways or drainage right-of-ways or tilling right through wetlands. Every year I get people asking me, what's the best herbicide for cattails, right? Because they want to get rid of them and they till them out, they'll burn them and everything like that. And it seems to be a never-ending phase of the water comes, it drowns out, you get your cattails, the riparian area is trying to take over again, and then they're back in there trying to battle against it and turn it back into cropland. The second stage, which results in actual soil loss, is the transportation of detached soil particles primarily by runoff water, to a lesser extent raindrop splash. So sometimes your raindrops can splash down and move soil that way, but mainly we're going to focus on the flowing bodies of water and their potential to hold sediment as it goes through the landscape. So we have some factors influencing soil erosion here. So here's a nice cross section of a stream here, which kind of shows how the stream velocity is going to go and where you're going to have the highest amount of stream velocity. So right in the middle, you're going to have the least amount of friction with your banks, and you're going to have the deepest amount of water to have a flowing column with the greatest velocity. So this is influenced by your slope topography. So how steep is your land? Are you dealing with, you know, a 2% grade, a 10% grade? We don't really have anything higher than 10% grade here on average, I would say, not in Lamont County. You're starting to get pretty steep after that. And then as well, your stream flow velocity and your ground cover, your root stability on your banks will all affect your soil erosion for your land. So here's some studies from the study that I mentioned earlier in 1985. It kind of compares different types of ground cover versus soil erosion. So they go through different crops as well as some grasses and things like that. So this picture is a little unrelated. It's just a good picture to show different types of root masses, right? So it says grasses and native plants have a very low erosion and tend to be very similar to the rate of deposition. So let's say you're eroding away per kilometer, you know, 5 tons of soil, but 5 tons of soil is also coming down the stream and settling back down. So you won't really notice any difference whatsoever in terms of soil loss because what's going is coming. And so this tends to be pretty lenient all the way into alfalfa and some tame forages. Depending on what types of tame forages you're planting, you might be looking at a little bit more soil erosion because their root mass isn't quite as strong. So we can see the numbers here. So these are numbers that are, these numbers are used for the calculations in the study to get your kind of tons per year loss. So we can see as we go down, cereals a little bit worse and canola being the worst, right, in terms of having a good root mass. So right here, I'll turn a little laser pointer on here. So this one's alfalfa here for your roots. So your roots aren't very strong, but the nice thing about the alfalfa roots is they're established all year long. So it's not like in the springtime, you have bare ground, you're planting your crop. That's when you're gonna have your most water running through, especially from your winter runoff. So it's nice to have those roots established and holding still. Whereas if you're planting barley, barley might have a better root mass. However, you've harvested your barley, so you might have some roots there that are kind of dead and decaying. They're not holding as well. You have more bare ground soil because you don't have grasses intermixed, right? So you're going to see a higher erosion factor from that as well. And then canola has pretty much a straight tap root, so you're not seeing too much root hairs and holding stability. Whereas you look at some of these other things like annual ryegrass, and you have quite a bit of matting there to help hold that soil in place. So what does it all mean? So the erosion factors that we were looking at before kind of translate into this graph here. So this graph, the LS is for your length of slope and then your soil loss in tons per year. So this is just kind of a comparison between different crops here. So as your slope gets shorter, you're going to face more erosion. So this is a gradient scale, right? It's not like that's 1 or 2 meters length of slope, right? This is a gradient scale. So when we're looking at this, the higher the slope is getting, the more loss we're going to see per year, just on average. So alfalfa still fairly low in the loss, right? You know, you're looking at four tons per hectare per year, right? Where cereals, you can get quite drastic, especially as your slope starts to increase. I know I'm looking off to the side here. That's just where my presentation is sitting on my screens here. But yeah, so as you get into your cereals, your row crops, and then of course your bare soil, right? So if you're doing summer fallow or you go by and you till, and so that seems to be kind of a common practice that I have taken notice to, is that every year they do their rounds and they till the outside of their field and around every wetland and then their creek bodies, right? And so that's the only tillage that they're doing every year, or at least they're going back through and harrowing it or breaking up the soil a little bit. But as you're doing that, you're losing your packing, and your sediments become looser and more susceptible to being eroded. So every time that you go next to your creek bed and you run your harrows through, especially in a drier year when farmers want to get the most out of their properties. So not only are they going next to the creek bed, but they might even be going into the creek bed. So then we're going to see opportunities for a good amount of soil erosion to happen. So this is one of my case studies here in Lamont County. So I've noticed this property, we have some good aerial photos for some data here. So this is a creek running straight through here. And so we're going to focus on that area and the different types of practices that he's been implementing over the last 2 decades. So we can see that soil erosion is not going to happen immediately, but he is getting pretty close to the streams with some tillage here, as you can see how the row crops are going by the stream body here. So in 2011, you can see these lines pretty much run straight through. So you can pretty much assume that he was going straight through the creek body at that time with his cedar and his cultivation. He's kind of trimming the side of the creek here with not a lot of a buffer going on there whatsoever. Even this creek here, he's kind of trimming along the side. He has not quite those straight lines going straight through, but he's definitely skirting it, staying quite close. Keep an eye on this wetland area here. It seems to be just a little bit too wet for him to get any kind of equipment in there, so it's kind of left alone. But we have a good buffer on the side here in comparison to the streamline here. So we'll see what happens over the next couple of years. So 2013, we started to dry up quite a bit, and you can almost not even see where the creek is in comparison to where the crop is, right? So he's cropped essentially right next to it. This wetland areas thankfully has still a little bit of protection on the banks, but we'll continue into 2018. So 2018, we start to see a little bit more moisture coming in. So now we're starting to see some area that's kind of backing off with some pooling on the sides and some areas that are left blank with no vegetation cover whatsoever because there's not an opportunity to get back in there and plant something, as well as we've been tilling it. So now there's no plants there whatsoever for an entire year's duration. And then we've had a flood in 2019 and 2020 that's caused the difference here in the map. So you can see, we've have our general areas that are just too wet, drowned out crops, things like that. We have good stability by this wetland here that I was pointing out originally. So we have good stability on terms of where he can crop and how he can crop. Whereas along this streamline in this creek bed here, we're seeing the ability to crop less area next to it or drowning out of crops in that area. But the big portion over here is the natural creek used to run in and through and back down to the creek here. And we have a large amount of divergence here. So I'll just back up one slide so you can see where that creek used to run there. And now we have a good amount of divergence here. So it's completely cut an entirely new channel, right? And so this is because he's been tilling that area so much. It's coming into a bend there. And instead of managing to bend around, you have your fast moving water that's flowing right into this bend here. And instead of curving around, it's decided to cut a whole new path. And because this is a kind of a steeper gradient here, as soon as it cut enough, it found a spillover and then it took off and made a completely new path. And so this is not just like, it's not just 2 feet deep or anything like that. Like in some spots here, we're looking at anywhere from 4 to 8 feet of soil erosion that's happened in one flood year. So that's pretty significant. That's a lot of soil loss. And unfortunately too, down by the roadway here, there's a culvert there. So he only has a small culvert for this whole stream system to go into. So he's received a lot of transportation of soil from over here all the way down and pooling in front of that culvert, which has created a larger patty of sediments here. And so that patty has now turned more into a stable wetland rather than being a flowing creek body. So you're starting to see things like braided streaming here because it just is filled up so high and the sediment's so loose that it just kind of wanders back and forth. You can't really take anything through there. So what happened in a flood event here was that the water has been shaping our environment for thousands of years and will continue to shape our environment. So there's not much we can really do to fight against soil erosion especially from fluvial water bodies if they're present. So what we've seen here is we've seen some serious sediment wash, some stream divergence, some stream channel deepening, as well as some sediment deposits. So this has created quite an issue for this landowner, as he's now kind of created an island of isolation, because it's got 4 feet on either side from the old creek, and now he's got 4 feet on the other side of the new creek, right? So he's got these 2 channels that are cut in, and this big area that he can't access anymore. And he's got a big sediment patty sitting at the bottom of his creek here. So why did the large scale erosion occur here? So we've had a drastic increase in flow velocity because we're in a flood year, right? We have some serious stream bank stability problems going on because we're tilling it all the time, as well as we don't have any vegetation coverage whatsoever. So, you know, this farmer has reached out to me before in the past in 2018, and he's asking me what's a good herbicide to spray on cattails, right? So he's spraying out his wetlands and he's tilling into them, right? And now we no longer have any vegetation. We don't have any soil stability there because of the tillage. And so we have some cultural and economic reasons on why that's happening. So we'll talk about the physical factors before we get into the cultural and economic reasons here. So some of the physical factors that have affected this is our stream flow velocity and how the water is coming around the bends and why it's taking away so much soil. So once we're starting to get deeper streams, we're starting to get faster flows, especially with the increased amount of water. So with the faster flows, you're getting a higher sediment capacity that can be held into the stream. So it's picking up more suspended particles, even larger aggregates maybe, and taking them and trying to transport them down the water bodies. So our stream bank stability here, if we notice that one area where we had that small wetland that he couldn't till, there was good stability there. We saw little to almost no erosion. The areas that he had no vegetation or was cropping next to with cropping vegetation, we have a much higher factor, as we've seen previously from the study, a much higher factor of soil erosion that can occur. And so we're looking at having bare ground in the springtime, which is probably our biggest influential factor. Because once you harvest your crop, especially if you're, doing canola or you're doing wheat, right, and you're going by and you're desiccating it before the end of the year, your roots are already breaking down by the time springtime comes around. So you're kind of losing all of those good little root hairs that really bind to the soil. And so we have nothing to really keep it in place. We have no large trees or shrubs for vegetations there whatsoever. So we have nothing as a deep-rooted containment as well. Our aggregate instability is a big one. So it's kind of been a general trend since the 30s to try and reduce tillage or do a zero tillage model, right? So this guy does do zero tillage, but like I said, most farmers do still go in and they do some harrowing and other things like that every year around wetland water bodies, which tends to be the biggest one, and then the edge of their field, right? So this happens to be one of those areas where it continually gets harrowed every year, right, in between cropping cycles. As well as we have no surface coverage material, so we don't have anything to hold it in place. We have no grass, we have no weeds, we have no roots, because it's all being either sprayed with herbicide every year to kill out all your native crop pests that come back every year, right? As well as we just have no grass coverage or anything like that going on either. And so we hopefully will try to avoid leaving exposed soil every year, because exposed soil is highly erodible to both water and wind. So it's probably not a great idea to leave as much exposed soil, right? So this is why we leave things like stubble and things like that in place to try and reduce our soil erosion. However, with the continual harrowing in the areas, we really loosen up those sediments. We get smaller and smaller aggregates every time we continue to till it. So we're no longer getting large aggregate clumps. We're getting down to you know, breaking it apart. You pull it, you put it in your hand and you crush it a little bit. And the next thing you know, you have dust or powder in your hand, right? So that's very erodible. Oh, and so, yes, here we go. So with cultural controls, so there's some things that we can do just as kind of, we like to say just best management practices or good stewardship, right? In terms of what we can do to maintain our landscape as the way it's meant to be, right? So this is things like crop buffers, and that's kind of the whole purpose of this presentation is to have crop buffers in place, right? And so that's why we have a grant available for landowners at this current time to install cropping buffers, right? To have cover crops, be mindful of tillage and proper use of herbicides, right? So proper use of herbicides is a big one. Not spraying on a windy day, right? Trying not to overhang your booms and things like that, right? I see it too often where you have, you know, 40, 60-kilometer winds and somebody's out there spraying canola with Roundup, right? The amount of herbicide drift, you know, going onto your buffers, going onto the roadway, going onto neighboring crops, right? Especially with a non-selective herbicide like that, you're getting into some dangerous territories, right? I get some people saying, oh, well, I have to control noxious weeds by the creek bed. So I put my crop there so that I can spray it to control the weeds, right? Well, the problem is when you put your crop there, you're reducing the coverage, right? And if you're spraying noxious weeds there, you have to be mindful of what herbicide you're using, right? Roundup's a great product. However, it's not the ideal product for spraying in grass, right? So if you're trying to maintain a buffer and keep a buffer there, spraying Roundup to kill your noxious weeds is not going to be a good option, right? You should be more cognizant of the water body itself as well if you're spraying herbicides. However, they have some different restrictions than some of us. So people talk about the productivity of their property. So they say, hey, you know, why would I leave a buffer, right, of, you know, 32 feet, 16 feet, when that's just unproductive acreage for me, right? You know, they want to get the most out of their property and they want to see the most amount of profit for their year, right? And so that's kind of a big cultural or economic mindset that really goes behind why nobody's leaving a cropping buffer there. So hopefully we can go over this a little bit and see if we can try and reduce that mentality of, you know, trying to squeeze everything out of your property, right? And trying to leave a buffer. So if we look here, so we're going to cut this in half and we're going to look at a quarter section, right? So this is 1/4 over here. We're going to look at this portion here where the most soil erosion has occurred. So if we look here, this is in 2018 before our big flood event. And then this is in 2020. So now we have this big area that's cut off here. We have quite a bit of sides that is now not arable due to water, right? You know, this area is bare ground. This is bare ground. It's pretty much all bare ground. You can see the soil from a satellite image, right? So, you know, that's pretty cognizant that there is bare ground going on there. And so as we look, we can see, you know, this is probably getting more than 16 feet away from the edge of the creek bank here. So what is the loss, right? So with rough numbers, we can say 16 feet by half a mile long, right? So 2,640 feet, right? Which kind of works out nice for a lot of us farmers because we're using, you know, we're either cutting hay with a 16-foot header, or we're doing something like that. So 16 feet by half a mile is 1 acre. So if we put a 16-foot buffer on either side of a water body that runs through your property, especially flowing creeks or streams, right? That'll be a total of 2 acres of buffer, right? For either side. That's if we had a poker straight stream, right? I'm not going to say that every stream's poker straight. So if we just throw on another acre, right, to satisfy some people in terms of what the actual amount of acreage is, or acreage we're looking at taking out of production, right? We're looking at a total of 3 acres. And even if you buffer that up to, like, you know, a whole 30 feet buffer or 32-foot buffer, right? You know, that's a pretty generous size buffer. And, you know, you're taking out approximately 4 to 7 acres, we'll say, in as a maximum, right? So if that was planted as canola, right, most likely it's probably going to look more like something like we're seeing in this picture here. It's not going to be the most productive canola, but even let's say it is, we're going to give an average 45 bushels per acre per year, right? And we're going to put the number of selling it at around 14. I don't want to use 22 because it's a really, really high record year for canola, because I know that's what it's going for in the area right now, but I'd like to be closer to the average, we're going to say. So at a cost, we're looking at, for 3 acres, to take out 3 acres, that's going to be a cost of close to about $1,900, about $1,890 is what it would yield out as if it was in canola, yielding 45 bushels per acre, right? You got to minus your inputs and everything like that off of it, right? So we're going to say rough $1,500, right? If you did that in hay, for example, and so you have hay and you're using hay as a natural buffer kind of thing, and you hay it every year, if you get 3 tons per acre, which isn't out of the question, especially with having a little bit more moisture in that area, right? You're going to be looking at about selling them for about $50 or $60 a ton is going to be about $550. So you're down about $1,000, but you're not going to run into any, or hopefully you're going to reduce the opportunity for you to run into any major soil erosion events. So if we look at this particular event here, we've made this island of isolation here, right? And this is pretty much now a big sediment patty. So this is, I would say, would be permanent damage to the field in terms of not being able to crop it, because you can't really get equipment in past these. This is a 4-foot channel on this side, and this is an 8 to 4 foot channel on this side. So you've kind of made an island here, and then this is a big sediment wash, right? So, you know, we're already at 8.5 acres there, right? That's taken out of production, what I would say relatively permanently, without the use of, you know, heavy equipment to really kind of beat down this old channel and try and flatten it out so you can get back in here, right? So you're at a overall loss now for your future, right? As well as, you know, you didn't really gain a lot in terms of profit for tilling and planting as close as you do to this water body. So with that, hopefully that's something to keep in the back of your mind in terms of cultural control, and maybe why you might want to do a cropping buffer, and maybe why you want to leave a little bit of natural wetland in your fields, and maybe reduce the amount that you're cropping for the sake of having a good riparian environment. So at this time, I'm going to take some questions, as I think I'm running a little bit longer than anticipated. So yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you, Brett. That was a really great presentation. I learned so much and really loved your examples. So we do have a question in the chat from Sarah. It says, when do counties usually intervene if you're noticing a farmer tilling into a stream? And what can counties do to prevent a farmer from doing that? Yeah, so we hopefully try to educate people as much as we can. So we try to do extension events like this, as well as, you know, we might talk to them and say, hey, like, you know, that's probably not best practice, right? Unfortunately, we don't have a lot of teeth to bite back on this, right? So we can report these cases to Alberta Environment, right? For them to kind of take over. We don't enforce the Water Act, which is probably the biggest one they'll get caught on, right? We do the Soils Conservation Act, but the Soils Conservation Act is kind of tricky and more focused to excessive tillage, more so than it is to fluvial erosion. So for the most part, education, and then we kind of go into that route with Alberta Environment. All right, thank you. I don't see any other questions coming up, so I think that we will go ahead and move on to the next speaker. Perfect, thank you. Thank you, Brett. All right, so our final speaker for this webinar today is Carrie O'Shaughnessy. She's a riparian specialist with Cows and Fish, and she's going to be talking to us today about techniques to control soil erosion. So I'll hand it over to you, Carrie.
Thanks, Michelle. All right. Well, thank you, everybody, for hanging in with us here for the first hour or so. We'd like to get a little participation from you at this point, just because with this poll. So we're curious to know what techniques have you used for soil erosion or restoration of eroded sites? And the poll will have a few options, and we'd love to see if you've done any of them. Good variety coming up so far.
I stopped the poll, so we've got 48%.
48%. All right. Good.
Can you see
Excellent.
the results there?
Yes, I can. All right. Good. So we've got a good mix of everything, which is excellent. And some people that have been doing some different things too. So maybe we'll get to hear about those later on. All righty. So this portion of the webinar is going to touch on some examples of soil erosion control techniques that Cows and Fish has been involved in. Generally, we're not leading the projects that we're involved in terms of you know, a lot of the what's the word I'm looking for? I'm drawing a blank. You know, in terms of the planning and design and things like that, but we're definitely part of bringing the people together that have that sort of information, that have that expertise, and also the volunteer capacity in a lot of cases to get some of these projects done. So I'm just going to go through a few examples that will highlight some different techniques that some of you may have heard of before and some of you maybe haven't. So as we've heard, you know, water is that driving force that is implementing or affecting what's happening on our landscape. And so with moving water comes great energy, and with that great energy comes great power. So, but it's a different kind of hydropower, if you will. It's the strategies of soil erosion control and restoration of eroded sites need to consider that interaction between the land and the water that both Tanya and Brett have highlighted so well for us so far. So from the Cows and Fish perspective, you know, we have that riparian landscape front and center in our mind, but we're also thinking about what's happening in the uplands and in the rest of the watershed as well. And it's trying to our approach is trying to look at a system and figuring out how we can help it come back to that dynamic equilibrium, which is that sense of stability, but yet being but still flexible and moving and resilient. So again, not trying to stop erosion with a lot of these techniques or examples, but how we can prevent it from becoming worse or getting out of control, or out of balance, as they sometimes say. So some of the examples that I'm going to touch on are these. So we're going to talk about some of the grazing practices, because also again, our roots are in agriculture, so we want to make sure that we bring some messages to those landowners as well as explore beavers, vegetative buffers, and some bioengineering examples, and some regenerative concepts as well. Obviously, this is not an exhaustive list of all the different types of soil erosion and restoration techniques out there, but just gets us started and gets people thinking. So if we think about some key principles about having healthy lands, these actually come from range grazing management, and they're all aimed at trying to maintain as much ground cover as possible throughout the year. So we've heard both Tanya and Brett mention that, you know, particularly in the springtime where plants aren't actively growing yet, if we don't have, you know, carryover from the fall with plant species and roots, then that's where we can have some accelerated erosion happening is in that springtime. So with these principles of riparian and upland management, it basically comes down to, again, finding balance between what the land can provide and what the use requires. And in a grazing example, that would be livestock forage needs versus, you know, the plant community. Providing effective rest after use. So this is ensuring that plants and the ground and waterways have a chance to just sort of recharge their batteries and recover from being grazed or trampled. The idea of avoiding sensitive times. So with riparian lands, that's typically fall and spring when soils are most wet, and fall when the woody plants are often more palatable to grazing animals and browsing animals. And then the last one is about distributing use. So what are the ways to redirect and sort of spread out the use so that, you know, all the effort or all the activity isn't at the bottom of the hill. So obviously, as I mentioned, you know, those started out as grazing and riparian management principles, but they can also be applied in many different situations for many different land uses. It just happens to be that the players are different on those landscapes, and the implementation strategies for achieving the principles might be slightly different. So I want you to keep those principles in mind as we go ahead and think about erosion. So what I find with, I guess, the most interesting thing about erosion, I think maybe one of the frustrating things that people maybe deal with, is it's kind of a vicious cycle. You know, if you've got long use periods that are stressing out that riparian zone or the uplands as well, basically results in that reduced vegetation and bare soil that leads to more erosion, sedimentation, and soil loss. And then also there's the element of compaction or hardening of the landscape. That also allows water to move faster and not soak in. And with that, the cycle begins or continues, I guess, because now we've got more runoff, which leads to more bare ground, which just carries on and on and on. So it just system just becomes more and more out of balance. And once that ball of yarn begins to unravel, you know, it can be really difficult to tie that back up. So from the grazing side of things, I mean, it's a bit more of an indirect way, I guess, of controlling erosion or looking at erosion and sediment loss, but it can be very effective over large areas. So one of the main things is basically, you know, trying to shift from a continuous use of a pasture or of an area to something that gives you more control. So things like using fencing to create a riparian pasture, which a riparian pasture is fencing management units that are similar in topography and plant community so that they can be managed accordingly with timing and intensity, and are generally wide enough to allow grazing within them without concentrating the activity too much onto the banks. So the riparian pasture in this, the riparian fence in this photo is sort of across the stream on this side, and then the other fence runs along the top of the hill towards the bottom right. So when you've got the luxury of topography, riparian pastures can be very beneficial. Then you have the flexibility, like I said, to rest or graze at an appropriate time. This is just an example to see of how that type of you know, management can affect the soil. So with fencing, it's not really the fence itself that helps with the erosion management or the erosion control. It's the ability and the flexibility to manage in a more balanced way and provide that flexibility to move animals in and out when the conditions change. So you could think of it as a way to be more adaptive to the erosion issue. The key with any riparian pasture or with any fencing as a tool is that the gates are closed and an alternative drinking water source for the livestock is provided. So another way to look at fencing is in a corridor or a bank exclusion way. And this is definitely still a possibility, but you need to consider that concept that Tanya talked about, that streams in particular, they will move naturally across the landscape. So offsetting wider is typically better, particularly in an area that might be a little less vegetated than is desired. Because otherwise that stream will move and the deep binding vegetation is not there, and that water will continue to eat away at the banks and may also end up consuming the fence as well. So with or without fencing, providing an alternative watering source away from that water body is key. It's about redistributing the animals away from the source water and giving them a more easily accessible, clean source that benefits not only the landscape, but also benefits the animal's health as well as weight gains. This is an example of a type of watering system that can be used. This one can essentially serve 2 pastures, or it can be moved easily because it's portable. And this particular one happens to run on solar. But there are a number of different varieties of systems out there. Again, it's the principle of providing that rest and providing distributing animals away from the source water. So similarly to riparian areas that under stress, they can start to show, lower vegetation vigor, bare ground starting to come through, whether it's with trailing or what we call pugging and hummocking, those lumps and bumps in the ground that just change the way that the ground works. The uplands can show that stress as well. And this is an example where over about 12 or 13 years under rest, the plant community just started to come back just with moisture and being able to respond to the moisture when it came, withstand some drought and recover quite well in that timeline. So the strategies of dealing with that upland and how that connects to what is happening in the bottomlands and in the riparian lands, there's a concept out there that's sort of come to my attention in the last few years, which is the idea of regenerative processes and strategically placing structures to promote natural processes, like the concept of, by Bill Zedike, if anybody's heard of him, or Van Cloche, that is let the water, do the work to help restore and regenerate some of these areas. From water, we have a colleague down in New Mexico. He's with the Watershed Artisans, that's his company. He describes the idea of strategically placed structures to promote natural processes as the idea of promoting the harvesting and storing of runoff and sediment with structures based on natural forms that initiate long-lasting regenerative processes. So I'm just going to touch on a couple of these that we've been exposed to in the last few years with the help of Craig Sponholtz from Watershed Artisans, and see what you think. So this is a Southern Alberta example where large grazing area where water basically flows as sheet flow off the hillsides and enters into these bottomlands, and there is a creek that is at the bottom of these hills. But in between the top and the bottom, there's this larger sort of flat area with a bit of slope that over the years livestock trails became a conduit for water. And as a result of that, there's this erosion and head cutting, these little waterfalls that show up, and it basically channels the water into a single channel instead of sort of feeding out, like braiding out across the top of the ground. So this is a similar thing that often happens in recreation scenarios when there's a truck trail or an ATV trail. Water often finds that path of least resistance. Often it's bare and ultimately starts to chew through. So the concepts that were learned here was about head cut control and grade control. So head cuts are those little waterfalls that form at a nick point where the gradient starts to change. And the concepts were Zuni Bowl, One Rock dams as well, in particular, that we got to try out here. So a One Rock dam is like a riffle. It's like constructing a riffle in an area that allows water to slow down, come up over it, and stabilize the channel bed, increasing the roughness. It's a place for vegetation seeds to get trapped and capture sediment as well, and ultimately gradually, slowly raising the grade level so that there's not so much speed with that water flowing. So just a bit of a close-up of a Zuni bowl, because I noticed that, you know, not many people had heard of it. It's essentially an in-channel head cut control structure that is composed of rock-lined step falls and plunge pools. So it's a way to sort of protect that original surface where water is kind of coming over and tends to chew backwards on, as well as leveling out that grade with a step and a pool throughout the length of whatever the design might be. So they serve as a place to capture water and capture sediment. And these designs, like I said, are originally developed with the Zuni Pueblo out of the States and Bill Zedike. These types of structures can also be made out of logs. So the idea of a log step down, same thing, just creating that step pattern for water to trickle or to move over so that it doesn't just come pouring over that head cut. And with that drop, of course, again, more acceleration, more erosive power, and it just pushes that energy downstream. There's also this concept about what I've sort of coined as destabilizing to stabilize. So this is a situation where an old ditch essentially began to cut and down cut through a crop field. And it was a large project, about 700 meters or so, to try and essentially establish a new floodplain on the bottom of this gully. The gully in a lot of places is 8 to 10 feet high. So the possibility of bringing the channel bed back up that far is deemed to be too expensive and would take too long to sort of reduce the impact that's just going to continue to happen. So a combination of things like rock baffles, live staking and seedling plantings, little constructed floodplain formations. The idea being that this kind of a rock baffle in a triangle shape, with those rocks strategically placed and interlocked with one another, they're not just dumped there, they're actually individually placed, could then capture some sediment, but also be a little bit of a hardened surface to force water to meander to the outside. So the goal here is actually to widen the banks, allow those big steep banks to fall in, so that a new channel or a new floodplain, a new dynamic equilibrium can be established in the bottom of the gully. So that's an interesting one. Starts to get quite complicated and expensive when you get to this point. So maybe a less expensive way to deal with some of these issues might be beavers. So if we think about the beaver ponds and the dams that are on the landscape and what their roles are, it's a combination of sediment storage as well as sort of slowing down that stream velocity and slowing down that stream power that Tanya mentioned. So little beavers are out there, you know, working on the landscapes all the time. Some places not where we want them to, but nonetheless, they're doing this work and can be very valuable in helping with mitigate some of the sedimentation or erosion issues that we're faced with. And with the water and with the ponds also comes vegetation. So again, always comes back to those plants for us, is where those plants can continue to utilize the sediments, utilize the nutrients, and can just continue that cycle. So that means that we have to keep beavers on the landscape in places where it's allowable. And so these ideas of coexistence tools, these things like exclusion culvert or culvert exclusion fences, or pond levelers, or even just wire mesh wrapping of trees, so that, you know, the beaver can still maintain its habitat but doesn't take the prized ones, are all sort of techniques that we as humans can apply to living and coexisting with beavers. And they may be able to help, like I said, with some of those erosion issues. So Buffers, another a concept or an approach to sort of managing the sediment as well as preventing the sediment from happening. So all of these techniques can be done preventatively, but they can also be done reactively. And of course, reactively tends to be a little more difficult to do. So just keep that in mind. So the idea with the buffers, of course, is to have a wide variety of vegetation that, particularly with croplands, is in between where the water is and where the crop is. So that buffer acts as a filter, it acts as a water store or a root store to hold soil together. And in forested situations can also act as shade or snow trap and a way to just keep moisture in the ground. This is an example of a project actually in Lamont County. So this one was a crop field, and they generally cropped right up to the edge of the area that as far as they could. But a couple of years ago, when it was so wet, they recognized, and they'd seen it in the past too, but it really hit home for them that seeding that area just wasn't worth it. So tapping into the program that Lamont County has right now through the Canadian Agricultural Partnership, which is a grant to help implement some different projects, they went with a 60-foot buffer, half of native species, half of tame species. And over the last couple of years, they've had really good establishment, and they've had great success with this project. So the idea with the tame is that they were able to even take a bit of a cut of hay off the outside strip last year, which helped to feed and supplement their cattle operation. And they like the success of this so much that they're actually going to do a similar thing on the other side. And it just gives them that flexibility. They don't have to worry about putting inputs into that low area that wasn't really productive to begin with. And they can provide all kinds of other ecosystem goods and services. Now, I think bioengineering is probably a pretty obvious one to people when they think about how they could potentially protect riparian areas, or at least those that work in the industry. And it's basically the idea of using live plant material to help stabilize an area. So there are some great examples on the City of Calgary Bioengineering Demonstration and Education Project website that I encourage you to check out if you want to get more in depth of some of these topics. So the first one I'm going to mention is live staking. So this is the willow staking because it's one of the, I guess, it's a fun thing to do, particularly with volunteers, and it can have a big impact. So it's using particular species that are suited to basically sprouting roots and sprouting leaves from a dormant stalk. So in all of these situations, it's basically about adding diversity, about adding structure and roughness to an area that might be eroding. And it also acts a little bit as an access barrier as well. So if somebody's having trouble getting through there, maybe that's what you want. There's many different ways to use live stakes. So there's brush layering, there's willow staking like we talked about, there's brush layers, fascines, wattle fences, all these different things. And I have to acknowledge Mike Gallant with KWL out of Calgary for this slide. I borrowed it from a presentation that he did that I thought was fascinating and very well done. So again, another resource for you guys to follow up with, and we can provide the links for you. The concept of wattle fences or live bank protection, this is the idea again of instead of using big rock, it's using plant material and soil material to construct basically a little retaining wall, but it's a live and living retaining wall. It starts out dormant and looking, like it's not going to do very much, but eventually those plants will start to sprout and add that root and capacity and binding capacity. And there's also ways to use non-woody plants as well, adding native seed, using sedge mulch to sort of fill in the gaps. So we touch a little bit on rock. So the concept of the regenerative rock is that everything has a reason for being placed and is placed in a particular way. I think the more conventional approach to the use of rock has been, the idea of riprap, gabions, that create a hardened surface that actually accelerates water and also has nothing to back it up if it starts to fall apart, if it gets undermined. But there's a sort of a more developing school of thought around riprap, and that's actually adding roots to that project. So putting willow stakes, for example, within a riprap bank, or creating live crib walls with really large wood. But again, always adding that live element to it. And we've talked a lot about streams, but I did just want to touch on the opportunity of applying some of these strategies to lakes and shoreline waterfront properties. This is an example on Pigeon Lake, where just over a couple of years, the landowner elected to stop sort of removing the vegetation and gave that shoreline a chance to grow up and respond. And we did put some live stakes in there as well, but it was more of the natural recovery of the grasses, the native grasses that are there, that actually got that shoreline sort of on a track to better stability. Weed management is an ongoing issue with a lot of these projects, so that was part of this as well. And there was also some upland, or sort of more inland yard scaping that was done as part of this project. That also sort of helped just reduce the amount of, or increase the amount of roughness that's there. And sometimes you just got to redirect the issue. Give people a chance, using bridges, using properly installed or sized culverts, where water is running, erosion is going. Generally, if people have an option, or even livestock have an option, they're going to take that. So as I wrap this up, just a few things that we all want you to remember, that there are many ways for erosion to occur, and that it is a natural process, but we can accelerate it. Flooding is how water bodies release the energy that they have. So being able to have water bodies that are connected to their floodplains is really important, and being prepared to accept that flooding is also very important. I think hopefully vegetation is critical, and the right vegetation is key. Hopefully everybody's taking that home with them. And we are often stuck in this reaction mode. So if we have a moment to take a breath and think ahead a little bit, we have the ability to sort of get in front of some of the issues that we may already be dealing with, that we might be able to help them not get worse. And thinking about that rest, that's just sort of how what I sort of mentioned, is just not only for the land, but also for ourselves. If we're continually battling, with this issue, hopefully there's a chance to take a breath, reach out to somebody, ask for help and advice. It's not easy to do, but it can be done. So just, I guess on that note, just really quick, these upcoming events are ones that Cows and Fish is directly involved in, and they all kind of expand on certain things that we talked about in this session today, which was pretty short. So we'll get those links out to you if you're interested. And the NSWA, or North Saskatchewan Watershed Alliance, has some events coming up as well, but I'll let Michelle touch on those when she gets to that. So just thanks again to the project partners in this, North Saskatchewan Watershed Alliance, Vermilion River Watershed Alliance, CAP, and Lamont County, and as well as the Cows and Fish members and supporters that allow us to be here with you today.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Carrie. So I did put links to all of those webinars in the chat for people to be able to access them. And we do have one question here from an anonymous attendee. So it says, what government financial assistance is available for leaving vegetation buffers?
Yeah, good question. So right now there are a few different programs, and they fluctuate from year to year or whatever 3 to 5 year period. But Lamont County specifically has a grant through the Canadian Agricultural Partnership, which is a funding source that they can use to help producers in that county, and other counties have that available as well. The watershed resiliency and restoration program is another one that's through Alberta Environment. And Michelle, if you have any questions about that, Michelle can tell you lots about it because she does a lot of work with that, and Cows and Fish also has some grants through them as well. And then locally, there are a number of communities in Alberta that have something called alternative land use services. It's a program that is actually locally driven, that provides implementation support, cost support, as well as some per acre payments for lands that are set aside for things like vegetated buffers in lands that would have, I guess, would have traditionally been tried to be farmed in that way. So that one's not necessarily a government program, but it's one that a lot of our communities in Alberta have, and that's alus.ca is the website for that, alus.ca, if people want to check that out.
Yeah, and I'll just add to that the Land Stewardship Center also offers a program for acreage owners called the Green Acreages Program. So you can go to landstewardship.org and find out more information about that.
Yeah, actually, sorry, Michelle, that just reminded me, Ducks Unlimited has a program as well related to wetlands more specifically, but might be another place for people to look into.
Perfect. All right, so I believe that we have one last poll that I'm going to go ahead and launch. So we have 2 questions here. 1, did you learn something today? And 2, what sort of erosion control technique do you want to try? So we'll give about a minute for you guys to answer that. And if you have any questions at this point, please just pop them in the Q&A box or in the chat, or you can raise your hand. Either way, we'd love to hear from you. It looks like about 50-50 of learning a lot or learning a little, but it sounds like everybody learned something. So that's really wonderful, something that we really like to hear. And it looks like people really wanted to try all of them, or the Zuni Bowl or the buffer strip live staking. So yeah, these are all really cool techniques. And it's great to be able to kind of use nature to help nature in that way. So yeah, thank you all so much for joining us today.